condemned to death and framed for a crime she didn't commit. A single mother stands in court as the world prepares to watch her fall. The evidence is stacked, the betrayal runs deep, and the verdict seems inevitable until the unthinkable happens. Just as the judge prepares to seal her fate, the courtroom doors burst open. What follows is a moment that will shake the justice system to its core. Discover the truth, the lies, and the twist no one saw coming in this gripping story of survival, betrayal, and redemption. The clang of the iron doors echoed like a final warning as Rachel Carter was led into the courtroom. Her wrists, marked with fading bruises, were shackled in cold steel. Her eyes, once bright with life, were now dimmed, rimmed with the weight of sleepless nights and broken hope. Her pale face showed no emotion, not because she had nothing to feel, but because everything had already been taken from her. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled, every corner leaning in for spectacle, not justice. Local reporters whispered into recorders. Sketch artists hunched over pads, eager to catch the expression of a woman accused of the ultimate betrayal. A mother, a widow, a supposed murderer. Rachel walked with measured, silent steps, escorted by two bailiffs. The hum of murmurs rose as she entered, but she didn't look up, not at the judge, not at the jury, and certainly not at the man sitting smugly in the front row, Gregory Carter, her brother-in-law and now her loudest accuser. She took her seat beside her lawyer, Mr. Langley, whose expression could be best described as distant. He offered no nod of reassurance, no glance of empathy. Instead, he shuffled papers, adjusted his tie, and waited in silence. He hadn't said much since the trial began, and today, the final day, he looked even less prepared to defend her. Across the room, the judge, a gray-haired man with heavy eyelids and heavier bias, leaned back in a chair with the detachment of someone who had already decided her fate. He tapped his pen lightly on the bench, glancing at the prosecution table like a man waiting for a show to begin. The prosecutor stood, sharp suit, sharper voice, and turned toward the jury with an air of performance. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "you've heard the testimonies. You've seen the evidence. And now, as we reach the close of this case, I ask you to consider one question. Who profit from a man's death?" His voice rang through the chamber. All eyes turned to Rachel. She said nothing, not because she was guilty, not because she lacked words, but because every time she had spoken before, every time she tried to explain, she had been met with indifference. Her grief was met with suspicion. Her silence was called cunning. Her tears dismissed as tactics. Flashbacks flickered behind her tired eyes. 3 months ago, flames consumed their lake house. The sky was orange with smoke. Charles Carter, her husband, the father of her son, never made it out, or so they had said. His body, or what was believed to be his, was found in the wreckage. The fire had taken everything: her home, her family, her peace. And before she could mourn, Gregory pounced. He stood in court now, poised and righteous. "My brother trusted her," he told the jury days ago. "She manipulated him, controlled everything. And when he finally tried to separate from her, she snapped." Rachel's stomach twisted. That wasn't true. They were working through things. There was tension, yes, like in any marriage. But they still laughed, still shared late-night coffee talks about their son's future. But no one asked her about that. Instead, the court was fed a trail of assumptions. A vial found in the trash, containing a trace of poison. A large sum wired from their joint account days before the fire. Emails, out of context, about a life insurance policy. All signs, the prosecution claimed, of a calculated, premeditated murder. Rachel's attempts to explain were cut off in pre-trial hearings. Every objection from her side was either half-hearted or outright dismissed by Langley. She remembered the first day she met him. A recommendation from Gregory, ironically. She had no idea at the time how much that connection would cost her. Now here she was. The judge leaned forward, clearing his throat. "We will proceed with closing statements before the jury enters deliberation." Rachel's breath caught in her throat. The prosecutor turned again to the jury, voice rising with practiced emotion. Charles Carter was a respected man, a builder of homes, a lover of life. And he died, poisoned and burned, at the hands of the woman he once called his wife. Gasps. Murmurs. The jury nodded. The atmosphere shifted again, leaning toward conviction. Rachel looked at them, finally raising her eyes. Not pleading, just looking, one by one, each face a verdict already carved in stone. They didn't see her. They saw headlines, stereotypes. Gangdan. Next to her, Langley stood reluctantly. Your Honor, he said, voice dry. We believe there's insufficient direct evidence to... That's enough, Mr. Langley, the judge snapped. You may sit. Some in the gallery chuckled. Rachel didn't flinch. She had nothing left to defend herself with but the truth, and in this courtroom, that truth had no voice. As the judge turned to prepare his final remarks, Rachel folded her hands in her lap. A single mom, accused of murdering the man she loved. No advocate, no alai, no one left to believe her. And the verdict loomed like a shadow that had already swallowed the sun. The courtroom sat in tense silence, save for the low murmur of paper shuffling as the prosecutor approached the bench with his final exhibits. Rachel Carter sat motionless in her chair, her hands resting in her lap, chained loosely, as if freedom were just close enough to mock her. The cold of the metal cuffs had long faded. What chilled her now was how little of herself remained. This, the prosecutor said, holding up a small, clear evidence bag, was found in the waste bin beneath the master bathroom sink in the Carter Lake house. He turned to the jury, holding it at eye level like a relic. Inside was a tiny amber glass vial, the label nearly worn away, the contents long gone. Traces of digitalis, poison, confirmed by our forensics lab, lethal in high doses, untraceable in tea or coffee. And according to the housekeeper's statement, Mrs. Carter made her husband's morning drink every day. Rachel didn't flinch. She had seen the vial for the first time 3 weeks ago when the photographs were submitted into evidence. It meant nothing to her then, and it still didn't now. She had never bought poison, but even if she screamed it aloud, who would hear? The prosecutor set the vial aside and picked up a second exhibit, a printed bank statement. And here, he said, pacing slowly, we have a transfer of $50,000 from a joint marital account, initiated just 2 days before Mr. Carter's death. The recipient? Untraceable. An offshore holding company with no known ties. But the timing speaks for itself. Rachel turned her gaze down toward the floor. She didn't remember authorizing that transfer. Charles had handled their finances. Always. But the explanation felt like a pebble thrown into a canyon. Barely a sound. No echo, swallowed by the silence. From the witness stand, Gregory Carter took a sip of water, then continued his testimony. My brother loved her, he said, his voice low and carefully measured. Too much, I think. He ignored the signs, the control, the way she isolated him from the rest of us. We barely spoke those last few months. Charles told me once he was afraid. He said he didn't know who she was anymore. The courtroom swallowed his words like gospel. Rachel clenched her hands, not in anger, but in disbelief. It was Gregory who had insisted on privacy. Gregory who hated when Charles sought help outside the family. And now, here he was playing the role of the concerned sibling. He never visited after the fire, never once asked if she was okay. He didn't even look her in the eye as he testified. He looked at the jury, always the audience. She closed her eyes, and in the darkness behind her lids, fragments of her old life floated in. Charles, standing barefoot in the kitchen, pouring coffee with a crooked grin. Their son, Noah, jumping on the living room rug as Charles tickled him until he squealed. Laughter, warmth, a time when no one wore masks. That life was gone now, burned like the house, stained like her name. A voice rang out again. Mrs. Carter, a police officer, had said during her first interrogation, you claimed your husband was alive when you went to bed, and yet he never walked out. Rachel had tried to explain then how she had awoken to smoke, how she had screamed his name, searched for him, even burned her hand trying to open the back door. But those words were never entered into the official report. Just her confusion, her hysteria. Even her in-laws refused to answer her calls. When she begged to see Noah, they said the state had taken him, removed him for his own safety. A social worker told her she was deemed emotionally unstable, pending the outcome of the trial. He was placed in foster care. And Mr. Langley? He hadn't even objected to that decision. Hadn't filed for visitation. Hadn't done anything but sit there and shuffle through motions as though he were fulfilling a routine, not defending a life. Rachel turned slightly toward him now, searching his face for even the faintest signal that he saw her, that he believed her. But he only smoothed the crease in his tie and scribbled something into his legal pad. She sat back slowly, alone. The jury's eyes followed the prosecution's dramatic retelling. No questions, no doubts, only certainty, solidifying with every pause and every phrase carefully delivered by the man trying to bury her. And in that moment, Rachel Carter understood something clearly. This wasn't about guilt or innocence anymore. This was theater, and she was the villain they had all come to condemn. Rachel Carter sat motionless at the defense table. Her wrists, freed of shackles, still bore their impression. Her hands, folded tightly in her lap, trembled ever so slightly, though her face remained unreadable. She'd long since stopped trying to look composed. What good was composure in a room that had already buried her? The judge adjusted his robe and cleared his throat. The sound echoed like thunder in a canyon. "This court," he began, his voice gravelly and precise, "is now prepared to deliver its ruling." Rachel's breathing shallowed. One inhale. Hold. One exhale. Stillness. The jury, seated in a neat line across from her, avoided her gaze. They all stared at the judge, faces carved from stone. Rachel had seen every one of them react to Gregory's testimony. She had watched them nod, frown, furrow brows when the poison vial was shown. Not one had ever looked at her as anything but the accused. To them, she was already the verdict. The judge reached for the sheet of paper in front of him, white clean, unwrinkled, unstained by the blood that would metaphorically spill from it. He lifted it with slow fingers. The bailiffs, sensing the final act, stepped closer to Rachel. One positioned himself behind her. The other moved toward the courtroom doors. She could hear the subtle jingle of keys, the dull creak of leather from a shifting belt. Rachel closed her eyes. The ticking of the courtroom's wall clock grew louder, as if it had taken it upon itself to mark the end of her life in single, brutal strokes. The judge placed the page before him, flattening it with his palm. "All rise," the clerk announced. Everyone obeyed. Wooden benches creaked. Rachel rose with them, but it felt like standing underwater. Her knees nearly gave way. Her stomach curled into itself. Her chest burned, not from fear, but from the immense gravity of helplessness. She wasn't afraid to die. She was afraid no one would remember who she really was. The judge looked up. His eyes scanned the room once, landing briefly on Rachel. There was no malice in them, just exhaustion, as though he, too, was ready for this to end, one way or another. Rachel blinked slowly, bracing for impact. Her hands clenched, then unclenched. The bailiff behind her shifted closer. The judge inhaled. In the matter of the state versus Rachel Carter, the rest blurred into soundless air. The syllables that followed hung in limbo, distorted by the ringing in her ears. The world narrowed to the rhythm of her heart and the distant, cruel march of time. A single tear welled in the corner of her eye, but didn't fall. She wasn't going to cry. Not here. Not in front of them. She thought of her son again, of how she had whispered promises to him every night in the foster care visitation room. "Mommy will come home." What if that had been a lie? The judge's mouth moved. His voice, strong yet hollow, filled the chamber. Behind Rachel, the bailiff shifted his stance. A hand hovered inches from her arm. Protocol. The moment the verdict was spoken, she would be removed. Escorted. Contained. Erased. Still she stood. Still she waited. A woman out of time. Out of breath. Out of faith. But not out of strength. Not yet. And in the thick, motionless air of that courtroom, where no truth had dared survive, Rachel Carter listened to the weight of a world closing in around her. The judge's voice hovered mid-sentence. The word guilty trembled on his lips, suspended in the charged air like a guillotine blade waiting to drop. Rachel Carter braced herself. Her legs, barely holding her upright, quivered beneath the weight of injustice and months of quiet suffering. She heard the sharp click of the bailiff's boots behind her, the tension of a courtroom leaning in, preparing for finality. And then, boom! The courtroom doors flung open with a thunderous crack, slamming into the walls with such force that the echo shattered the silence like glass. Everyone turned. The judge paused, startled. The bailiff froze. A gasp rippled across the rows of seated spectators like wind through brittle leaves. In the doorway stood a figure, tall, unsteady, dust-covered. His overcoat hung loose, too big now on a frame that had lost weight and strength. One leg dragged slightly behind him as he walked forward with the gait of a man just learning to move again. But it wasn't the limp that stunned the room. It was his face, scarred, partially healed. The skin on one side was red and taut, the ghost of a fire etched into flesh. But even beneath the burns, some recognized him. A woman in the gallery clutched her chest. A man dropped his pen. "Charles Carter," someone whispered, barely audible, but it shot like a lightning bolt through the room. Rachel's eyes snapped open. Her body jerked, stunned not by the noise, but by the voice. Her vision blurred, her mind refusing to believe what her ears had caught. The man continued forward, his boots scraping against the polished floor, every step defying death. The judge stood now, hands pressing the bench. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice low and shaken. The man stopped halfway down the aisle, then reached up and slowly removed his cap. Even from where she stood, Rachel saw the eyes, the same deep-set, thoughtful gaze that once watched her while she read to their son. A tremor ran through her arms. He raised his voice, gravelly and worn. "I'm the man you're sentencing my wife for murdering." The room erupted. Screams, gasps, cries of disbelief. Reporters leapt from their chairs. The stenographer's hands hovered above her keys, frozen in midair. Rachel didn't move. Couldn't. Charles was alive. The judge's mouth opened, then closed again, his face drained of color. This cannot be. But it was. The man standing in the aisle, bruised, burned, and breathing, was Charles Carter. "I have identification," he added, pulling something from his coat pocket and holding it out to the closest bailiff. "My fingerprints, dental records. It's all there. But none of that matters if you listen to what I came to say." The bailiff took the papers, staring at the man as though he were a ghost. Rachel still hadn't moved. She couldn't. Her knees threatened to give out, her vision blurred at the edges, but her heart had started pounding again, louder than it had in weeks. For months, she'd imagined that fire in her dreams, over and over. Imagined Charles calling out, imagined herself running in too late. But now, here he was, walking through the courtroom like some miracle dressed in ash and flame. Langley, her lawyer, leaned forward now, visibly rattled. His jaw worked, but no words came. Gregory, seated with the prosecution, rose slowly to his feet, eyes narrowed, lips parted in disbelief. The judge banged the gavel, his voice cracking. "Order! Order in the court!" But order was gone. The gallery burst into whispers and shouts. Some people stood to see better. Others looked to the heavens as though the laws of man had just been turned inside out. And in the midst of the chaos, Charles turned to his wife. Rachel looked at him now, her mouth parted slightly, hands still trembling at her sides. "I'm here," he said gently, voice softer now, "and I should have been here sooner." She didn't reply. Her eyes were full, wide, too overwhelmed to hold expression. But one tear slipped down her cheek. It was the first one she'd let fall since the trial began. The judge slammed his gavel again. "Clear the gallery. I want order now." But the storm had already arrived. Not in anger, not in violence, but in truth to save her. Charles Carter stood before the judge's bench, still weathered from months in hiding, his voice rough but steady. The scars across his jaw and cheek caught the flicker of fluorescent light above, reminders of the inferno that nearly erased him. Rachel, seated now, remained locked in silent disbelief, her heart suspended between hope and fear, between miracle and misunderstanding. The judge adjusted his glasses, hands trembling slightly. "Mr. Carter, if you are who you say you are, the court requires." "I'll explain everything," Charles interrupted. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The calmness in his tone commanded the room in a way no gavel ever could. "I'm not here to make a scene," he continued. "I'm here because I watched my wife get crucified in the media, torn apart in this courtroom, while the real criminal sat comfortably a few feet from her." His eyes drifted to Gregory, who shifted uneasily in his seat. Rachel's so-called protector, the grieving brother, the voice of justice, suddenly looked very small. Charles turned back to the judge. "I started noticing missing money about 6 months before the fire. Our real estate firm manages dozens of high-end developments, and the books weren't adding up. At first, I thought it was human error, but the gaps were too precise, too clean. Whoever was behind it knew how to cover their tracks." He paused, glancing toward the jury, as if to draw them back into reality. "So I started digging, quietly. I didn't tell Rachel. I didn't even tell my accountant. I didn't know who I could trust. That was my mistake." His voice tightened slightly, and his gaze hardened. "Eventually, I found the link. Gregory, my brother, he'd been siphoning company funds using shell corporations, small ones, layered through vendors. I traced nearly $500,000 to accounts tied to his name. When I confronted him at the lake house, he looked down, jaw clenching. He didn't argue. He didn't deny it. He smiled, so it was already done. Said I wouldn't live long enough to ruin it." Gasps rippled through the courtroom, but the judge raised a hand for silence. Charles continued. "He offered me a drink. I was tired, angry, stupid. I took it. I don't remember much after that. Just waking up in the middle of the night with my throat burning and smoke choking my lungs. The house was on fire. I could barely move. I don't know how long I crawled before I reached the back door, but I managed to break through the window and drag myself out." He paused, one hand instinctively brushing the side of his neck where the scarring was worst. "I blacked out in the woods. A ranger found me the next morning, unconscious near a trail 3 miles from the lake house. I had no ID, no phone. My face was unrecognizable. The burns were bad. My lungs were worse. They airlifted me to a remote care facility in the hills, one that treats undocumented patients and burn victims. I was on a ventilator for 2 weeks. No one knew who I was." Rachel listened, frozen. She hadn't blinked in nearly a minute. Her fingers were dug into the fabric of her skirt, breath shallow. "I spent months recovering," Charles went on. "No meetings, no television, barely any speech. I had to relearn how to talk. But when my voice came back, so did my questions. I asked for a news report. I needed to know what had happened." His voice dropped low. "I'll never forget the headline. Widow on trial for murdering millionaire husband." Her picture, Rachel's face on the screen, was the first clear thing I saw after I got my eyesight back. The courtroom remained locked in stunned silence. "I wanted to come back right then," he said. "But I knew Gregory. If he'd orchestrated all this, if he'd gotten Rachel arrested, then he might have corrupted more than just the company. The police, the attorneys, the courts. I couldn't just walk into town and expect justice to welcome me back." His eyes drifted briefly to Langley. The defense attorney stiffened. "I had to be sure. So I waited, contacted a private investigator through the clinic staff, asked him to watch the trial, gather evidence, and send it to me. And what he sent me told me everything I needed to know. I couldn't stay silent anymore," Charles said. "So I came. Maybe too late. But I wasn't going to let this go one more day." The judge leaned back, clearly shaken, looking between the scarred man in front of him and the woman who had been moments away from a death sentence. The gavel trembled in his hand. Charles turned to Rachel at last, his voice softening. "I'm sorry," he said simply. Rachel's eyes met his, wide, wet, and brimming with disbelief. The man they said she'd killed was standing between her and a verdict that might have ended her life. A silence hung in the air, heavier than any gavel ever struck. It was not the silence of order or respect, but of something ruptured, something old and broken, finally tearing apart under the weight of truth. Charles Carter stood at the center of the courtroom, his breath steady despite the burn scars that still pulled at his skin. His voice, though worn, echoed through every corner with unflinching clarity. "And the man hired to defend Rachel?" Charles said, turning slowly toward the defense table. "He was never on her side. Langley was paid to make sure she lost." Every head turned. Mr. Langley froze. Charles reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, which he handed to the judge. Bank records. Transfers made to Langley's offshore account 2 weeks before the trial began. Payments from a shell company tied to Gregory Carter. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The judge's eyes narrowed as he scanned the documents. Langley's hands trembled now, visible even from across the room. His jaw tightened, the flush rising up his neck like guilt catching fire. "That's absurd," Langley muttered, standing. "I demand." "You demand nothing," the judge cut in, voice ironclad. "Bailiff." Langley's chair scraped against the floor as he tried to back away, but it was too late. One bailiff grabbed his arm. Another blocked his path. This wasn't," Langley sputtered, but his voice faded as he was pulled aside, shackles clicking closed around his wrists. The courtroom watched in stunned disbelief as the man who had been Rachel's supposed advocate was dragged away, red-faced and silent. Gregory stood, pointing a shaking hand at Charles. "You're lying. You're doing this to save her. This is all lies." Charles stepped toward him. His limp still noticeable, his stride slower than it once was, but there was nothing weak in his movement. His presence had weight now, undeniable and righteous. He stopped just short of Gregory, their eyes locked. "You set a fire," Charles said calmly, "but you couldn't control what would survive it." Gregory's lips curled into a sneer. "You're just trying to rewrite everything." "They believed me. Everyone believed me. Because they didn't know the truth," Charles said. "But they do now." The judge pounded his gavel once. "Mr. Gregory Carter," he announced, voice cold, "you are hereby placed under arrest pending a full investigation into charges of fraud, conspiracy, attempted murder, and obstruction of justice." Gregory's expression twisted into panic. "No, you can't. This is my brother. He's gone mad. He's not well." 2 bailiffs approached, and Gregory flinched as they moved in. He backed into the jury rail, eyes darting toward the exits, but there was nowhere left to run. The courtroom, once his stage, was now his cell. "Don't touch me," he barked, but the bailiffs didn't flinch. They grabbed him firmly by both arms, pulling his hands behind his back. "You did this," Gregory shrieked at Charles. "You ruined everything." Charles didn't answer. He didn't need to. Gregory's shouting echoed, then weakened, his voice collapsing under its own desperation. "She was nothing without you. I gave her everything she had." Charles turned to the judge. "She never needed anything but truth. And for 3 months, you let this court take that from her." Rachel sat motionless, her eyes wide. Then her hands began to shake. Her lips parted as if to say something, but no words came. Just breath. And then, finally, tears. The first sob came suddenly, bursting from her like a dam cracking open. Her body shuddered, her face crumpling with all the grief she had buried to survive each hour of this trial. Tears ran down her cheeks, silent at first, then trembling into sobs she could no longer hold back. She wasn't weeping because she was weak. She was weeping because she had been strong for too long. The entire courtroom remained frozen. No one spoke. No one moved. Even the judge, stern and impassive through it all, lowered his eyes, as if recognizing the weight of the injustice that had taken place under his watch. Rachel's hands came up to her face. She covered her eyes, shaking, breathing in stifled bursts. And still, no one said a word. The courtroom, once full of conviction and certainty, now stood silent. Not out of guilt, not even out of pity, but out of stunned, humbling recognition. Everything they believed was wrong, and the woman they nearly condemned had never been the criminal. She had only ever been the victim. Rachel Carter sat motionless at the defense table as the judge straightened his robe and laid his gavel down slowly, deliberately. He no longer held the conviction he carried just an hour earlier. Now, he looked like a man confronting the weight of his own blindness. "This court," the judge began, then paused. He looked at Rachel, truly looked at her, for the first time since the trial began. Not as a defendant, not as a criminal, but as a woman who had stood under the crushing weight of accusation and never buckled. "This court finds no cause to continue prosecution," he declared. "All charges against Mrs. Rachel Carter are hereby dropped." A collective breath exhaled from the gallery. Rachel didn't move. The words landed, but her body hadn't caught up. For weeks, she had imagined hearing them. She'd whispered them to herself at night like a prayer, but now that they were real, she didn't know how to react. Her hand stayed frozen, her shoulders still tense, until she felt it. A touch. Familiar, warm, and real. Charles had stepped to her side, scarred but solid. He took her hand gently. She turned, meeting his eyes, the firelight still there, tempered by pain but bright with something else. "I'm here," he whispered, "and I'm not going anywhere." She nodded once, then slowly stood. The bailiff stepped back, no longer a guard but a witness. The chains were gone. The burden had shifted. Rachel walked forward, past the jury box that once held eyes full of judgment, past the prosecution's table, now abandoned, past Langley's empty chair, where Betrayal once sat in a polished suit, and past the place where Gregory had unraveled, now just a hollow shadow at the edge of her memory. Charles walked beside her, never letting go. The courtroom doors opened, and for the first time in months, Rachel Carter stepped into daylight. Cameras clicked instantly, reporters shouting her name, flashes exploding like fireworks. The crowd had doubled, maybe tripled. But Rachel didn't hear them. She didn't see the headlines forming behind those lenses or the questions waiting on every journalist's tongue. All she saw was the blue sky above the courthouse. All she felt was the wind brushing across her face like a welcome home. A black sedan pulled to the curb. The back door opened, and there, on the seat, hugging a small stuffed bear, sat her son. "Noah." She whispered his name like it was sacred. He saw her eyes wide. "Mommy." Rachel ran, falling to her knees as he threw himself into her arms. She held him so tightly it seemed she might never let go again. He buried his face in her neck. Charles stood nearby, watching them with tears in his eyes, one hand over his chest, as if steadying a heart that had taken too many hits. Rachel pulled back, looking at her son's face. "I missed you." He nodded. "I knew you didn't do it. I told them." She smiled finally. Not a smile for the cameras. Not a smile to convince the court. Just a smile for her child. For the moment. For the life she nearly lost. Rachel stood once more, this time with her son's hand in one and Charles's hand in the other. The courthouse loomed behind them, gray and cold. But ahead, down the steps, across the street, and into whatever lay beyond, was freedom. She didn't know what the future held. But for the first time in a long, long time, she was free to walk toward it. If this story touched your heart, like, share, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for more powerful, soul-touching stories that restore faith in humanity.